This section of Frame is a section that picks out of Van Til those places where he seems to oppose the idea of system. And on page 307, Frame says this: "The necessity and freedom of God's will are also paradoxically related. If God's will is directed by His intelligence, then His free acts, creating the world, for example, become necessary. God had to create. If, on the other hand, God's free acts are truly free, then it would seem that they must be unconnected with His intelligence and therefore random." I'll read that quotation again. This is Frame summarizing Van Til's position. This is not Van Til's. This is not a quotation from Van Til, though I rather suppose, from what I know, some of these phrases are Van Til's words, but he's put them together. This is what he says: "The necessity and freedom of God's will are also paradoxically related. If God's will is directed by His intelligence, then His free acts, creating the world, for example, become necessary. God had to create. If, on the other hand, God's free acts are truly free, then it would seem that they must be unconnected with His intelligence and therefore random." The trouble with this paragraph, which I've read a couple of times, is that neither Frame nor Van Til define necessity nor freedom, and certainly the phrase truly free. And therefore what is said here really is not intelligible. Then, beg pardon? Well, I'll try to. In the first place, there are various kinds of freedom. We agree, don't we, that in this discussion we're not talking about political freedom. That's another kind. The Arminian doctrine of free will means that God cannot control our wills. We make our decisions quite apart from any influence that God has on us. Or I'll define it this way, and I'm talking about human free will. Free will is the equal ability to choose either of two exclusive processes or acts under any given circumstance. And in saying this, I think I represent very accurately the position of the Arminians. That is their notion of freedom, and it is, I think, recognized. The equal ability to choose either of two incompatible lines of action under one set of circumstances. Now, another kind of freedom, which you find discussed in the Middle Ages, is the freedom of the will from the intellect. Now, this is different from the Arminian point of view. They may overlap some, but it is different from the Arminian point of view. The freedom of the will from the intellect. That is, you are able to do what you are able to act in opposition to what you know, what you really believe. Yeah. I'm not sure. He nowhere defines freedom. Now, the absence of freedom, in this sense, would be indicated by Luther's volume on the bondage of the will. You remember Erasmus wrote a treatise on the freedom of the will, and Luther at first thought it was such a trivial affair that it wasn't worth paying any attention to. And then Erasmus's friends circulated the rumor that Luther had been defeated. He couldn't answer Erasmus. And this disturbed Luther's friends more than disturbed Luther, but they finally persuaded him that he had to answer Erasmus. And so he wrote one of the masterpieces of Christian theology, which I hope you all read, The Bondage of the Will. And of course he and Calvin were absolutely in agreement on this. Now then, if you talk about freedom of God, I suppose what a person ought to mean is that there is nothing external to God that controls him. But that doesn't seem to be what is meant here. Here, the idea is that God's will is independent of his intelligence. And this would make God schizophrenic. And I don't think we want to say that. So here are several definitions of freedom, and the quotation, and so far as I know anything else that Van Til's written, really does not define freedom. This sort of thing occurs in the controversy which Van Til and I engaged in for some years. He would say that I make logic superior to God. Well, that's sort of nonsense. Logic is the way God thinks, and God's thinking isn't superior to him. That's the way he is. And so these words are not defined, and you see, Frame falls into embarrassing language, because after he talks about God's freedom, then he has to enforce it a little bit by saying truly free. Now that doesn't add anything. That simply shows that the man's embarrassed. Now I must make this statement with a little hesitation because I'm not quite sure of it. But so far as I know, the last philosopher who tried to keep God's will and his intellect distinct was Descartes, who lived in the 17th century. And this attempt on his part seemed to have failed. And, well, maybe some Arminians have tried to do it. I don't know, but at any rate, I don't know. That is the last attempt that I know of to distinguish between God's will and God's intellect. So if you insist on a very unified personality, you don't have that duality.